I'm an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. And for the past 45 years, I've been in active practice of a yoga lifestyle. And for the past 20 years or so, I've been doing research on yoga. I'm also the director of yoga research for the Yoga Alliance, and my role there is really to provide education about the science and research that we have on yoga. So my topic today is yoga, understanding the biomedical science and research. And I want to start with definition because there are many people practicing many different things that they're calling yoga. And a lot of people are practicing just the postures and exercises that you see depicted here. And these are very different than Western aerobic exercises. There's a lot of stretching, there's inversions, isometric exercises, and so on. And certainly that is part of yoga. It's the most visible part of yoga. However, traditional yoga practices really incorporate multiple practices. Another one is the breathing exercises, a variety of different breathing techniques. A deep relaxation is important practice within yoga. And then perhaps one of the most important components is the meditative component of yoga practice in traditional yoga practices. And we'll talk about these different elements as we go through the talk. So for the purposes of this presentation, what we're really doing is talking about this type of traditional yoga practice. And most yoga researchers are aware that this is really traditional yoga and the way it was practiced historically. Now, I want to turn your attention first to the prevalence of yoga, and there is research on this. These are statistics from the United States. We have surveys in a few other countries, including the UK, and what they're showing is an increase in the prevalence of yoga practice. And what you can see here is that in 2017, 14% of the US adult population is actively practicing yoga. So that's a substantial fraction of the population from an epidemiological or sociological perspective. This is highly significant. This is a major movement in society. What's also remarkable is the trend you see here going from 6% to 9.5 to 14.3. There's a 50% increase in these 2 5-year intervals. And this is a dramatic increase. If this trend were to continue, then in 2022, we're going to see about 20% of the population practicing yoga. So this is really a major movement in society. Now, this talk is about research, and you might want to ask yourself why we should be talking about research on yoga when we really should be just practicing it. Well, I think certainly we're seeing this grassroots movement of yoga being practiced in ashrams and studios and yoga centers and gyms and spas across the world. But what we're seeing now is an implementation of yoga into what I'm calling mainstream society. And that means our public schools, the workplaces, and the healthcare system. Now, in order for that transition to really be effective and take place wholeheartedly, we really need the biomedical research that justifies that implementation into these venues. So that's why the research is so important. The other aspect of research that's really important, especially for yoga teachers, is that it provides a new languaging. It provides the biomedical languaging for how and why yoga works and why it should be something that can help people in their daily lives. So let's turn now to the psychophysiology of yoga. And we are seeing a dramatic increase in the amount of research that's studying the physiology and the psychology of yoga practices. And one of the pieces of evidence for this is we're starting to see reviews of the yoga research in public literature. So for example, on the left, Harvard Medical School actually invited me to be an editor on a book they've called Introduction to Yoga. And this is quite remarkable. Harvard Medical School is aligning itself with yoga in this way. And this is actually a sign of the times. And on the right-hand side, you can see this is actually from the Harvard Health Publishing branch of Harvard Medical School. And they have a number of pages devoted to the benefits of yoga, discussing the research and how it can be beneficial. Now, in the scientific literature, the way this manifests is that scientists will publish what they call review papers. And these are summaries of the literature written for other scientists. And so these are examples, some of the recent reviews that have been published. On the top, this one is how yoga reduces stress. Below that, yoga and immune system functioning. Below that, neurophysiological and neurocognitive mechanisms in yoga. Again, how yoga reduces stress. And on the bottom, potential self-regulatory mechanisms of yoga. And this is really due to this increasing body of literature that we can have these reviews that summarize all of this science and research. We've also summarized this in chapter 4 of our textbook, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. And this chapter really summarizes the research on the psychophysiology of yoga, just as these reviews do. This book itself is actually remarkable because this is an edited medical textbook that was contributed to by 60 yoga researchers around the world, providing summaries of the research on many, many different medical and health conditions. Now, going back historically, we can see some of the roots of what turns out to be some of the underlying principles that really sort of are the basis for the most fundamental aspects of psychophysiological changes. And one of the types of studies that was done in the early days was actually studying these advanced yoga practitioners, trying to see what happens in their bodies and their minds when they are doing these yoga practices. And some of these, of course, were done in India because that's where all the yoga masters were. This is probably the most comprehensive study of that kind. It was done by a research team composed of 2 leading scientists from the University of Michigan and UCLA, who went back to India for an entire year, traveled all around the country, hooking up all the yogis that they could find, these masters, and had them do their practices, hook them up to this portable recording equipment you see here. And their conclusion from this extensive study was that physiologically, yogic meditation represents deep relaxation of the autonomic nervous system without drowsiness or sleep. And this is really describing this meditative state. And the reduction of autonomic nervous system activity is significant because it was believed at that time that the autonomic nervous system was out of our control. It's part of the stress or fight or flight system. And here are these yogis able to control this system that was believed to be automatic, or as it was called, autonomic. Now, this introduces perhaps the most important and central construct underlying the entire field of what we call mind-body medicine, and certainly of yoga, which is in that field. And that is the construct of self-regulation. The ability of these practices through training and time to be able to control internal state, both psychological and physical or physiological. Now, why is that important? Well, self-regulation is really a construct that's largely absent in modern medicine. In modern medicine, when we need to treat a person for some kind of disorder, the doctor administers a pharmaceutical or a surgery or something like that. The idea that a patient can actually alter his or her internal functioning is not really recognized that well, except in the field of mind-body medicine. So this is really novel and introduces the potential of self-care, the ability that patients can now change their own internal state. Now, of course, yoga has these physical postures and exercises. There's a lot of stretching that goes on, and there's a lot of isometric holding of exercises. There are many, many studies now that have been done on those physical aspects, which are very easy to measure. And they provide very hard evidence. This is just an example of one study showing that naive people who were given a yoga practice after 8 weeks were able to show improvements in flexibility of a number of appendages, muscular endurance, and muscle strength. And so this is really no surprise. And what we know, and what's starting to become evident, is that when you manipulate the body, you make changes in behavior, make changes in stress levels and emotional functioning. You can affect your psychological state by physical exercises. And there is actually a body of literature showing that aerobic exercises actually have positive benefits on mental state. Another example of this is a study that compared actually conventional exercises such as long distance running and sprinting, people who practice these on an ongoing basis with people who practice yoga regularly. And what they were measuring was just something important for cardiovascular disease, which is fat mass percent. And what you can see is control subjects that don't exercise intensively have the highest level, where yoga equally is low in fat mass percent to those that are doing long distance running and sprinting. So you can see the positive benefits of yoga as a physical practice. Another feature of yoga, as we mentioned, is the breathing techniques. And one of the most fundamental breathing techniques in yoga is the long, slow, deep breathing. And the research that's now coming out showing the effects of slow, deep breathing are really quite remarkable. Slow, deep breathing has direct effects on the stress system, on so-called sympathetic activity, which is involved in control of blood pressure. And what you can see in this study, in the group that is doing this slow abdominal breathing that's characteristic of yoga, is that immediately after they start the breathing, their systolic blood pressure decreases. So this is evidence that the sympathetic nervous system is quieting itself down, and that is allowing this reduction in blood pressure. In fact, there's a whole body of research now that's starting to evaluate the benefits of slow breathing for high blood pressure patients, for hypertension. There are other remarkable effects of slow breathing, including the fact that slow breathing is highly efficient. And this means that it can be used in circumstances where there's a challenge to respiration, such as at high altitude. Now, I want to jump to sort of the cutting edge studies that we have in modern medicine and modern biotechnology to evaluate yoga practices. And one of these is so-called neuroimaging. And what's pictured here is the fMRI, which is one of these large machines that can peer into the brain very precisely from second to second and look at the activity of a specific nucleus in the brain and tell us what's going on in that nucleus. These techniques can also actually look at the levels of structure in different regions of the brain and see how they change over time. So this has really allowed us to examine meditative practices very precisely. And one of the types of studies that's been done is to actually ask the question, well, meditators claim that they experience better mental state and better functioning psychologically. So one way to test this is to actually compare meditators with non-meditators in terms of their brain functioning. And there are a number of studies that have been done showing differences, and this is one that was done some time ago. And what they found in this particular study, comparing non-meditators with meditators, that there are changes between the two. And the observed changes appear in structures that underlie the attention network, and also those that relate to emotion and autonomic function. So the attention network is that network in the brain that's involved in your control of attention. And of course, meditation is essentially the passive, relaxed control of attention. So the more you practice meditation, not surprisingly, you see improvement in activity in the attention networks. And then we've talked about autonomic function, which is tied to emotion, and that is mediated through the limbic system. And so in fact, we can actually see changes in brain activity in emotion regulation with these neuroimaging techniques. Another feature of the brain is its ability to change structure over time. This is called neuroplasticity. The brain changes its structure to accommodate your behaviors. So for example, someone who learns to juggle, those regions of the brain that are involved in the juggling act, both the motor and the sensory aspects, increase their structure. More connections are made, there's more blood flow to that region of the brain. So there's structural changes in the brain. Now, of course, yoga is a form of activity, both meditative and physical. So it's not surprising that we would see research that asks the question, can we change brain structure when we practice yoga over time? So this is a study that was done at our National Institutes of Health in the United States. And what it was comparing was long-term yoga practitioners with non-yoga practitioners. And what they were looking at was the experience of pain tolerance. In this case, in this particular study, it was cold pain tolerance. And what they found in this chart on the left is that for those people who were longtime yoga practitioners in the black dots, overall, they had gray matter volume. The region of the brain involved in that region of the brain involving pain regulation was actually larger on average than it was in the non-yoga practitioners. Furthermore, you could also see that their cold pain tolerance was better on average in the yoga practitioners than it was in the non-yoga practitioners. What this is telling us is that when you practice yoga over the long term, you are able to regulate pain more effectively, and that region involved in pain regulation increases in size and structure. And the graph on the right just reemphasizes that. What they compared here was the duration of yoga practice in these long-term yoga practitioners, and there was a correlation between how long they had been practicing yoga and the actual volume of that region of the brain. So the longer you practice, the larger that region of the brain gets. Now, one of the features of meditative practice is this control of the attention networks. Now, when you engage in a meditative practice, what happens not long after you begin focusing your attention in the act of meditation is that you notice your mind starts to wander. And then you notice that, and then you bring your attention back. And that cycle continues. And that is actually the act of meditation. Virtually everyone who meditates has that experience of intrusions of mind wandering, interrupting that focus of attention. So meditation is actually a cycle of holding your attention and then mind wandering. If we really want to understand meditation, we really need to understand the whole process. And that means we need to understand mind wandering itself. Now, this is a study that was done actually on mind wandering at Harvard Medical School and published in one of our premier biomedical journals, Science. And they studied mind wandering in the general population to look at these characteristics. And what they found was the not surprising conclusion that people's minds wandered frequently, regardless of what they were doing. But the interesting finding in that study was people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not wandering. And so their conclusion was that the ability to think about what is not happening, in other words, mind wandering, which takes place in the future or the past, is a cognitive achievement that comes at an emotional cost. So why is there an emotional cost associated with excessive mind wandering? Allow your mind to wander uninterruptedly all the time. And the consequence is this less happiness, this emotional disturbance, this mood disturbance. So why would there be a mood disturbance? Well, if you think about mind wandering, it's actually a survival mechanism. It's a mechanism that we have that animals don't have. It allows us to predict the future, analyze the past, and that allows us a survival advantage. So as one of the consequences of that, of course, is that we are often thinking about survival. Now, we may not be thinking about the saber-toothed lion at the cave entrance, but we are thinking about balancing our checkbook, about making it to work on time, and whatever else is going on in society. And the more we think about those thoughts, of course, they're stress-provoking. Survival is an uncertainty. You don't know if you're going to make it to work on time or you're going to keep your job. So if you constantly are thinking about those kinds of stressful thoughts, each time you have one of those stressful thoughts, you have a little bit of a stress response. As you continue that 24/7, 365 days of the year, you end up with a mood disturbance. You're less happy. If that really gets intense and you really start ruminating, you could end up with a psychological disorder like anxiety or depression. So what happens in meditation? Well, when you focus your attention, and this can be on the breath or a mantra or a candle or the flow of thought itself, mind wandering takes a back seat. So you quiet the mind down from the mind wandering. So in a sense, for the amount of time that you're successfully holding your attention, the mind is not wandering, and that's kind of like a holiday from mind wandering. So you have less reactivity to a lot of those stress-provoking thoughts. But a more important consequence of that practice, because meditation is a practice that you get better at, is the ability to self-regulate your attention over time. And this over time leads to a state that we call metacognition. Now, this is a very important feature because metacognition, the underlying construct behind it, is the idea that we have thoughts, but we are not our thoughts. In other words, therefore, we have some degree of ability to control those thoughts. And that's what happens in meditative practice. You then become less reactive to your stressful or negative thoughts, and you'll be able to control the content of thought. You can even change your thoughts. This construct is actually the same construct underlying one of the most powerful forms of psychotherapy today, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, whose goal is to achieve this idea of metacognition, the ability to have some degree of mastery over your thoughts. So this really explains a lot about the benefits of yoga and meditative practices on mental state. And in fact, there are not only activity changes in the brain that reflect this, there's even structural changes in the brain. So because you're reacting less, your emotional brain is reacting less. And the amygdala within the limbic system in structural imaging studies, actually in long-term meditators, the amygdala actually gets smaller because you're using it less. So that's an example of neuroplasticity in that positive direction. We can actually see this phenomenon of meditation taking place in the brain scanner. So this was a study that was done with people meditating in the brain scanner. And they have now images of which regions of the brain are active in these two major states, during the focus phase, when you're successfully holding your attention, and in the mind wandering phase, when your mind is wandering. And what you can see is that these are very different patterns of brain activation. When you're successfully holding attention in the focus phase, what's being activated is the so-called dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is in the frontal lobes of the brain where the executive networks are, where the attention networks are. So that all makes sense. When the mind is wandering, it's an entirely different pattern of activation. And what's being activated is actually a network of brain regions that are related to each other, and it's called the default mode network. And what we know now is that people who spend too much time in the default mode network are more prone to psychological disturbances and potentially even psychological conditions. And people who spend more time in the attention networks during meditative practices are more resilient to emotional ups and downs. So this is really allowing us to understand the underlying neurophysiology of how all of this works. We know that there's inhibitory connections between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, the emotional brain. So this really accounts for how these practices can lead us into stress regulation and stress resilience. Now, jumping to an entirely different field of modern science is the field of molecular biology. And one of the areas here is the action of our DNA and how our DNA affects our functioning. And what I've got pictured here is the central dogma biology, which states that DNA produces transcripts, RNA, which then produces proteins. And these proteins then are involved in production and regulation of small molecules. And this whole process actually determines the functioning of everything in the body. So this is really a central feature of all biological organisms on the planet. What we know about this central dogma biology is that we can make changes and we can affect these transitions. Not only can we affect these transitions by our behavior or our diet or our activity, we can actually change the activity of the genes themselves. This is called gene expression. Now, we can't change the genes themselves. That's our inheritance, but we can change the activity of genes because genes can increase their activity or they can decrease their activity. And a best example of that is smoking cigarettes. If you smoke a lot of cigarettes, you are actually turning on genes, upregulating the activity of genes that are likely to produce a cancer tumor. If you do the opposite, if you engage in healthy behaviors, have a good diet, stay away from junk food, eat less sugar, you're actually going to downregulate those genes responsible for producing cancer, and in fact, those genes that are responsible for a number of other diseases. So we can actually affect our gene activity. And so not surprisingly, we now have a number of studies that have been looking at the genomic expression effects of mind-body practices, including yoga. Now I'm going to show you a lot of these studies, but there is now a recent review, and it's entitled, What is the Molecular Signature of Mind-Body Interventions? A Systematic Review of Gene Expression Changes Induced by Meditation and Related Practices. And what we see is changes in gene activity in functions that we want to improve, like immune function, and reductions in gene expression in areas that we want to reduce, such as chronic stress and inflammation. And so we can now see the genes changing their activity with respect to these functions after we do these mind-body practices, including yoga and meditation. So this is a phenomenal field of research because it's very objective, it's very powerful, and it provides evidence at the cellular and molecular level that the yoga practices that we're doing affect us at the cellular and molecular level. And we will see studies coming up that show that not only are we reducing symptoms and disease with these practices, but we can actually see the genes that are involved in those diseases changing their activity as well. Now, I want to turn our attention to one of the most fundamental aspects that I've already been talking about to some degree, and that is stress regulation. If someone comes up to me on the street and says, in one sentence, what's the best benefit and the most common and robust effect of yoga practice, it's got to be stress management. And in fact, that's one of the major reasons why people come to yoga practice. This graph shows a study that we conducted a number of years ago on beginners yoga students, asking them before their beginners yoga program why they were coming to yoga. And one of the biggest reasons was actually stress management. Over 75% said that was one of the major reasons that they were coming to yoga practice. And that actually shows up a lot in the literature and the research studies, because what we see is a lot of research showing that yoga is very good at reducing stress in a variety of populations, both normal subjects, people who are stressed, and people who have disease states. In fact, this is a review that was published fairly recently that not only showed a number of studies confirming that yoga reduces stress, but the markers they used in those studies were objective markers, which gives us much more confidence in those changes. Things like reduced evening cortisol, which is a stress hormone, waking cortisol, ambulatory systolic blood pressure, resting heart rate variability, and even lipid values. And what this is really affirming is this improved regulation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is involved in the stress response, and the other stress system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, whose output is the stress hormone cortisol. So yoga is pretty reliable at being able to manage stress regulation through modulation of both of these systems, the autonomic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Another feature of yoga practice, and this largely comes through the meditative component, is that when we control our attention, we increase our ability to attend. And that increases our level of what we call mind-body awareness. We become more aware of our body because our sensitivity to sensory information is made more acute with the control of attention with practice over time. Now, mind-body awareness is now popularly also known as mindfulness. And we can measure mindfulness because we have a number of questionnaires out there now that measure levels of mindfulness. So this is a study that was done in Germany looking at long-term yoga practitioners. And what they did was they gave them a mindfulness questionnaire to measure their levels of mindfulness. And they divided the yoga group up into those that were practicing at a high level, very often, frequently, those that were practicing moderately, and those who had marginal practice, and compared them with those people who were not practicing yoga at all. And what you can see is a very clear dose relationship between the amount of yoga practice and the level of mindfulness. So very clearly, this is telling us that the more you practice yoga, the more you are increasing mindfulness. And because the meditative component of yoga is a key component of yoga practice, that's not surprising at all. We actually showed this in a study that we did with young adult musicians. And just after 6 weeks of practice, we were able to see improvements in mindfulness scores compared to controls that did not practice the yoga. And this particular questionnaire that we used had subscales, one of observing, the ability to observe, and your level of awareness. And the yoga group was better than the controls in both of those as well. So mindfulness is something that can be improved over the short term, just even within 6 weeks of practice. Now, as we practice over time, over the short term, and this, I mean minutes, or certainly a yoga class, there's this immediate arousal reduction. You can immediately induce what Herb Benson, meditation researcher, coined as the relaxation response. It's the opposite of the fight or flight response. You reduce arousal, physiological arousal. The stress systems quiet down. And that's associated with a sense of physical and mental well-being. And of course, that's why people are popularly going to yoga class. You get stressed all day, you go to yoga class in the evening after work, you chill out, you cool down, you're able to enjoy your evening much more. So that happens over the short term. Now, as we practice over time, you start to go to yoga classes regularly, twice a week, 3 times a week, over months. You start to see these improvements in behavior and function. And one of the things, as we mentioned, improves is mind-body awareness or mindfulness. Our stress regulation capacity, our self-regulation of thoughts improves. That leads in our ability to be resilient to stress. And what happens to some individuals, and many individuals who practice over the long term and adopt what we might call a yoga lifestyle, where they practice daily, they do a yoga diet, they're living in a community with other yoga practitioners. Many people report over the long term a psychological and philosophical transformation. They'll say things like, yoga changed my life, which is really pointing to something much deeper. And I think where that change comes from is from the induction of these unitive states of consciousness, the sense of feeling at one with everything that can happen during meditative practices. And it's a very profound state. Even if you just experience that for a few seconds, it can be very life transforming, and people end up changing their life meaning and purpose. Now, that level of transformation we can actually measure. And the German study that I mentioned recently also had a spiritual well-being questionnaire they administered to all of these long-term yoga practitioners who, again, they did put into these categories of high, moderate, and marginal practice. And not surprisingly, the total score on well-being, again, was a dose-response curve. The higher level of practice was associated with higher spiritual well-being scores. And subscales of that questionnaire on hope and connectedness and experience of sense and meaning, again, were experienced more highly in those people who practiced regularly. So certainly this is happening over the long term. However, we were able to show through a study with young adult musicians that we could even make changes on the short term. There's an experience called the flow state, which occurs during an activity in which one merges with that activity. There's a sense of a lack of thought and rumination, and one is completely immersed. It's a very blissful state. And musicians often experience that with their music. And so with this 6-week intervention with these young adult musicians, we were actually able to show improvements in the flow state with this questionnaire that were not evident in control subjects who did not practice yoga. And a subscale of that called the autotelic experience, which is that unitive state, also showed improvements in the yoga group. So this slide here is what we call a logic model. And it is actually the most important slide in my entire presentation. So yoga is this multi-component practice. It leads on the physical level to improvements in fitness, flexibility, strength, coordination, balance. It improves self-regulation with stress and emotion, leading to resilience and equanimity. It improves awareness by focusing attention, increasing mindfulness, cognitive ability, concentration, and leading to this very important state of metacognition. And then finally, there's even what I'm calling spirituality, the induction of these unitive states, transcendence, the flow state, which leads to transformation and change in life, meaning, and purpose. So we're changing human functioning on a broad spectrum of activity, and that leads to changes in global human functionality on the physical level of health and performance, on stress and emotion regulation, mind-body awareness and metacognition, to the deepest experiences that humans can have, positive behaviors, values, and even spirituality. So this really sums up how yoga is working and the benefits that it can have on a multiple number of different levels of human functioning. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this body of research on yoga is increasing, and there is a whole field of research on yoga for specific conditions. And this was summarized in our paper 5 years ago, where we looked at the trend of this research. And what you can see is this explosion of the number of research publications on yoga for a variety of different medical conditions. So this area is really exploding in terms of popularity. And we now have an association of yoga therapists in the United States. We have the International Association of Yoga Therapists. Other countries have their associations. This whole idea of yoga therapy for the treatment of disorders is becoming very popular. And this organization hosts its own meeting and a symposium on yoga research, which I coordinate, which is only possible because of the growth in this field of all these researchers coming to yoga. So we use this as a forum to increase the strength of our field of yoga research. And I've mentioned earlier this Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. This is a remarkable textbook because this is really the voice of yoga researchers. This is really the evidence base that we have supporting the benefits of yoga, not only for psychophysiology, but for all of these different mental health and physical health conditions. Now, I want to end with just some examples of where this fits. We have taken yoga into stressful work environments. So one example is that we have taken this to Harvard medical doctors in the hospital here in Boston, given them 6 weeks of yoga using a Kripalu yoga-based program called RISE. We showed reductions in perceived stress at the end of the program. And a few months later, after the long-term follow-up, that perceived stress was still reduced. The resilience to stress was increased and maintained at the long-term follow-up. And this whole idea of yoga for healthcare providers is really critical because there's a whole phenomenon of burnout in the modern healthcare system. And we're seeing that right now with the virus epidemic, because that's even putting a more stressful burden on healthcare providers. Harvard Medical School has actually recognized this burden in medicine and has actually mandated a mandatory resiliency program for its Harvard medical students. So first-year medical students are getting training in a number of mind-body practices such as yoga, Tai Chi, and cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, in terms of psychological benefit, as I mentioned, our textbook really covers that, but there are reviews also summarizing this. This is a review paper looking at a systematic review of yoga for neuropsychiatric conditions showing positive benefits. And another study we've done looks at a number of mental health conditions, which has been a specialty of my laboratory. So this is an example of a study we did on yoga for generalized anxiety disorder. Just yoga itself is able to reduce scores of anxiety on a number of different outcome measures specific for anxiety disorder. And we've taken this pilot data and published this and completed a study that shows that yoga is almost as good as cognitive behavioral therapy in improving anxiety scores. Now, most relevant to today is how this might tie into something that's very important to us all at this point in time is immune function. And there's a whole field of science now called psychoneuroimmunology. The idea that our mental performance and our mental characteristics can actually affect our immune functioning. And what the main finding is here is that the inability to cope with emotion and stress effectively impairs immune function. And that's shown in this particular diagram here, where we can see the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis exhibiting negative impact on immune function cells. So this is a very real phenomenon. And so the potential here for yoga in terms of immune function is that yoga can remove that stress, that chronic stress, and allow the immune function to function better. So that's the virtue of yoga in these particular times. And of course, the other virtue of that is that quality of life can improve. Not only will people be less at stress and less anxious and less emotional, but they will be able to sleep better. And that, of course, is a very important feature. And sleep is directly related to the level of psychophysiological arousal or stress. So these are very important features, and sleep itself is actually very important for immune functioning. If you deprive yourself of sleep, you actually see decrements in immune function. So we do have a body of evidence that's just starting to grow on the field of yoga for immune functioning, and this is a recent review paper summarizing yoga and immune functioning. And summarizing the papers. I'm just going to show you one example. This was done in university students who are themselves under some degree of stress. And what you can see in the top left, they had a control group and a yoga group. And this is cortisol, a stress hormone. You can see that after the period of the time of the intervention, the control group actually got worse. They got more cortisol, more stress hormone, whereas the yoga group did not increase very much in their levels of cortisol. In terms of the other stress hormone, adrenaline, what you can see is the yoga group reduced their levels of adrenaline much more than did the control group. And then they also looked at two markers of immune function, IL-12 and interferon gamma. And what you can see for IL-12 is the dramatic increase in the yoga group with no change in the control group. And then also a modest increase in the yoga group for the other marker that did not occur in the control group. So we do have direct evidence of yoga's ability to positively impact immune function. Another study which showed that a yoga meditation could improve immune function actually looked at markers, molecular markers. And this particular practice was called Kirtan Kriya. It showed suppression of the expression of inflammation-related genes and the upregulated of expression of genes involved in antiviral and immunoglobulin responses. In other words, improved immune function. And these were dementia caregivers, people who are under really severe stress. So another example of a study showing the positive benefit of yoga on immune function. So I close with acknowledgements to the International Association of Yoga Therapists, which I work with very closely. I'm also indebted to the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, which is very recognizing of the value of research, and I've been conducting research with them for 10 years now. I'm also the director of yoga research for the Yoga Alliance. And the Yoga Alliance is a very large organization representing many, many yoga teachers I provide certification services. And my role is really yoga research education, is to bring what we call yoga research literacy to yoga teachers and practitioners. And we find that this is very important because when yoga teachers have the language to be able to describe the biomedical benefits of yoga practice, that allows us to move into mainstream society with the appropriate language and allow us to get into mainstream societal institutions like healthcare and public schools. And one of the things that we've done to provide a resource for yoga research is that we've created yoga research pages. And we have sections on basic research in normal subjects, special populations, and all the research that's been done on yoga for different diseases and conditions. And so this is sort of a way for yoga teachers and the general public. This is an open access website for people to get access to some of the review papers that summarize what we know about the biomedical benefits of yoga from these research studies. And I'm also the research director for the Kundalini Research Institute, which supports the style of yoga that I practice. So I thank you for your attention. And I now want to move ahead and to the Q&A and take some questions. So what I see is one question here. If anxiety is very high and the body feels like locked down, what is the best thing to do? Well, as I mentioned, the benefits of yoga occur very rapidly. In fact, one of the most powerful techniques is simply very slow breathing with meditation on the breath. When you do that, the levels of anxiety and stress drop immediately. This is, as I mentioned in the talk, what Herbert Benson referred to as the relaxation response. We have, as human beings, have the capability of reducing the fight or flight response. And the changes that occur psychophysiologically are the opposite of the fight or flight response. The stress response gears us up to a threatening challenge. So our blood pressure increases, our digestion shuts down, we have more blood flow to the muscles to prepare us for flight, our senses become more acute, and that is all driven to a large degree by stress hormones, which are good in the short term because you want to have those stress hormones working for you when you have to deal with an immediate challenge. However, what happens in modern society is that we're coping with what we call chronic stress. We're constantly bombarded time after time after time with these stressful events, no opportunity for the stress system to recover. And so these practices, these self-regulation practices in yoga and meditation can calm the stress system down. That's the whole idea of self-regulation. And as I say, this can happen within minutes. And there's a lot of studies we have that show that certainly over a single yoga class or even just a 20-minute meditation session, we can reduce levels of stress. And that's correlated with improvements in a number of mental states like anxiety and depression. So another question here is, where could I locate the mindfulness questionnaires you mentioned? And there are a number of mindfulness questionnaires. There's over a half a dozen of them. And a lot of these are available. You can actually Google search for them. Google Scholar will pull up papers. But the best place is to actually find the actual reprints, the publications that have put these papers together. And you can search a website called PubMed, P-U-B-M-E-D, which is really our resource as scientists to find papers. You type in the word mindfulness and questionnaires, and you'll get a lot of papers that show these questionnaires. And some of these are actually available free online. And these are used for research in meditation and yoga routinely. Now, another question is, Kundalini Yoga is very different to Hatha. Which form of do you feel has the greater benefit on the stress system? Well, I'm not going to compare my style with everybody else's styles because obviously I'm biased. I'm practicing my style because I believe it's the best. But what I would say from a scientist's sort of unbiased objective, and which is now starting to be supported by some research evidence, is that you want to gravitate to a yoga style which has more of the traditional components. There's a lot of yoga that's being practiced out there that is just postures. There's no relaxation, there's no meditation. People come in, they sweat, and they leave. That has benefit, no doubt. There is benefit through the nature of these exercises, as I've mentioned, through the mind-body effect. But when you add breathing techniques, you add specific relaxation practices, and you add meditation techniques, you're just putting so many more things in the mix, so many things that are alone themselves very powerful at improving your benefits. So I would always answer that question by saying, adopt a yoga style which is more along the traditional lines that incorporates all those 4 components of yoga: the physical postures, the breathing, the relaxation, and the meditation. And if you want to go deeper, by all means, adopt what we call a yoga lifestyle, get into a yogic diet, and all of the other behaviors that advanced yogis practice. And that will give you even more of a benefit. The next question is there a map between yogic and scientific ontologies? For example, bandhas and deep muscles. Are there objects corresponding to chakras? So the problem with studying these so-called esoteric things, or what we call energy medicine, the field of energy medicine, these subtleties that are in the yogic literature, the idea of chakras and prana and nadis and all of these other phenomenon. One of the problems with them is that we really don't have tools to measure these. If they are truly subtle phenomenon, then they're not electromagnetic or anything else that we can measure. So that makes it very, very difficult. Many people have argued that there's a sort of a correlation between physical anatomy in certain plexi in the autonomic nervous system and the central nervous system and the chakras. But that's, again, speculation. So it's very difficult to talk much about that field of research because we don't have the instruments that really allow us to do those kinds of measurements. Perhaps someday we will. And if these phenomena are real and shown to be real, then we can start looking at how they change and how they may or may not contribute to the benefits of these practices. But that is something that you could add to that logic model as energy phenomenon that could actually quantify some degree of additional benefit that yoga has. So I'm now down to, that was the last question. Is there anyone else that's got another question? Okay, there is one. There's a couple more, sorry. Do you see yoga becoming more utilized in mainstream medicine and schools going forward? I certainly hope so. You know, this thing with Harvard Medical School, I am teaching first-year medical students the basics of yoga practices and advising them how to adopt a yoga practice and how to find a yoga class that fits for them. Certainly, it's got a need in stressful occupations. It certainly has a need in medicine, especially given what we've got now called the epidemic of non-communicable disease. One of the risk factors for this disease, these diseases, is actually chronic stress. And yoga is an excellent tool, as I mentioned throughout the talk, for dealing with chronic stress. So yoga's got the ability to manage a factor that modern medicine has no solution for. There's no pill for stress. So given the importance of stress in modern society, that's a positive feature. The other thing that yoga can provide with respect to non-communicable diseases is that the risk factors for these diseases are things like low levels of physical activity, dysfunctional diet, and negative behaviors like cigarette smoking and excessive alcohol consumption. When you practice yoga and meditation, you become more aware of your body, you increase your mindfulness. That means you end up gravitating towards things that you now feel make you feel better, that are good for you, and you gravitate away from things that you now feel more intensively, like the negative impact of smoking a cigarette. So actually, mindfulness can actually change behavior in a positive way. And given these risk factors for non-communicable disease, I think there's a huge potential for yoga as prevention for non-communicable diseases. That applies in the schools as well. Our school children are highly stressed. There's a lot of surveys that show a very high burden of mental health conditions in our kids. And they need these skills. These are fundamental skills. The ability to induce these relaxation states is a skill that we have to learn. It should be in our schools as far as I'm concerned. And my lab has conducted a number of studies in schools showing some benefits, although the research out there is still very small and needing to grow. But I think there's a huge amount of benefit to be had by implementing yoga across our societal institutions, including the schools, the workplace, and the healthcare system. Another question I want to take is, in getting more yoga into healthcare, are you finding a tendency to have the healthcare system pick up only sequences, posture, breath, meditation that has been researched, or are they more open? Well, this is an evolution, and we are in the field of yoga research in medicine. We are in its infancy. The kinds of questions we're asking are: does yoga do anything at all? Show me anything. Throw everything you got with yoga at this disease and show me just anything you've got. That's the question we're asking. And there's a lot of subtleties to be determined after we've answered that question in the affirmative. One question is obviously, how much yoga do you need? If you practice one yoga class a month, can you cure diabetes? Obviously not. Do you need to practice 3 hours of yoga a day for 8 months to cure diabetes? You probably don't need that much to get some benefit. So we need to quantify how much yoga you need, how intensively you have to practice, how much yields a certain amount of benefit. Another question is, what type of yoga is best? And this comes back to this whole issue of how much of the postures, how much of the exercise, how much of the breathing techniques, and how much of the meditation do you need? Do you want to put more meditation in a yoga intervention for a mental health condition? Do you want to put more physical activity into an intervention for low back pain? These are important questions. And these are the next step in the research, but right now we're at the very beginning of stages. And so ultimately we may have prescriptions like that, where we might say that this particular type of yoga is best for this particular type of disorder, which some of the research is showing in a very general way that the comprehensive yoga, incorporating all components, is most beneficial. Another question is, has there been any research on the effects of chanting mantras and or music? Well, the problem with this is that you have to disentangle it from meditation. What aspect of that is meditation? What aspect is due to the chanting? And so it's a very difficult question to answer because you have to tease those out. And the other thing about chanting mantras is a lot of mantras have meaning for a lot of people. They may be spiritual or religious significance, and that can add to the benefit of these repetitions. So that's a difficult question to answer. You'd somehow have to separate those, to say it's the chanting itself that's producing something and not the meditation on your chanting that's due for all of the effect. Perhaps you can have someone chanting and watching a television program and someone chanting and meditating on the chant and see what the differences are. And perhaps that could be a research design that might tease this out, but it's a very complicated question to answer. Are there countries you are finding more open to adopting yoga into their healthcare systems? I would say yes. So for example, Sweden is amazing. There are over 80 hospitals and clinics in Sweden which have adopted yoga as a treatment for many, many, many diseases. I think the UK is starting to open up dramatically because of it's a single payer system. And so they are really faced with the challenge of reducing costs. And prevention is a way to do that. So the whole idea of social prescribing for yoga is something that I think the UK health care system is starting to be open to. We still see a lot of resistance in the mainstream healthcare system, certainly in the US. However, in the United States, we have a separate medical system for the veterans. It's called the Veterans Health Administration. And what we see there is the implementation widely, actually, of integrative medicine practice, including things like yoga. They're much more open to that than the conventional healthcare system is. And again, that's a single payer system. They are driven to reduce costs. And so if yoga can prevent disease and reduce problems with mental health without having to pay for drugs, that's a saving. And it's also actually leading to better quality of life overall. Another question is, there is a lot of information out there regarding the use of hand mudras to help with certain physical and mental health conditions. Is there any research that supports the use of mudras in yoga therapy? Certainly mudras are a very, very common part of yoga practice, and there's a lot of information in the literature. There's books on mudras, and there's a lot of claims to the benefits of specific mudras. Again, this is not something that has been studied yet. Research takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of time and money, and it's very difficult to convince a funding agency to fund something that's just a little bit more speculative than yoga itself. But it is quite possible that we could have research at some point in time in the future on mudras specifically, but I'm not aware of any strong or credible research at this point in time on that topic. So here's a question: does Vipassana meditation give the same benefits of yoga practice? And I would say that yes and no. I mean, in the specifics, the meditation practices in yoga and Vipassana or mindfulness meditation are somewhat different. In yoga, we do more of what's called concentrative or single point focused meditation. We focus on the breath, we focus on a mantra. Whereas in mindfulness, you're focusing more on the flow of sensation or the flow of thought. These are activating slightly different brain activity. So on the short term, yes, different brain regions are being activated, but there's a commonality. Both of those types of meditation will reduce the activation of the stress response system and induce what we call the relaxation response. So yes and no to that question. In terms of the degree of benefits, I believe you're better off practicing yoga, because in yoga, not only are you practicing meditation, and we do mindfulness meditation practices in yoga, in many styles of yoga. So in yoga, no, you're not just doing meditation, you're also doing these other practices. So as I've mentioned, the more practices you do that are related, I think you're going to have a stronger benefit. So I would always argue that I believe that yoga is going to be overall, in the long run, a stronger practice than meditation alone. Here's a question about, the research seems to mainly focusing on asanas, dhyana, pranayamas. What about the other limbs of yoga? And I mean, yes, I think what we're really focusing on in the research is how yoga is manifesting in the world. And it's manifesting in the world through the yoga class. And the yoga class consists largely of those four major components. Now, it's quite possible that the yamas and niyamas and those other limbs are doing something else that may add to that benefit. But I think we're really focused more on those main four elements from the biomedical perspective, because there's evidence and there's a rationale for why those should be working psychophysiologically. Another question: do you know about any research done of yoga in children with autism? This is an area that has a number of publications, but again, it's really in its infancy. But we are seeing some positive benefits, because these practices are bringing the kids into their bodies. And that connection between mind and body is actually very important in these autistic disorders. So there is some preliminary research that's been done, and it is encouraging, but it has a long way to go. Another question is, what if students don't want to meditate, but they are happy with breathing practices, asanas, and relaxation? I mean, that's fine. I mean, a lot of people choose what they want to practice. A lot of people want to practice meditation alone. A lot of people want to practice postures alone. A lot of people want to practice pranayama alone. It's a buyer's market. You can do whatever you like. But to me, it's a lost opportunity if you don't combine the focus of attention with physical practices like asana and relaxation. If you're practicing an asana and you're constantly thinking about what you have to do at work tomorrow and the problems you had with your spouse yesterday, that's not helping. And so that focus of attention, the meditative practice during the asanas and relaxation, I think is of benefit. And you don't have to be intense about it. You don't have to do sort of formal meditation where you stop and sit and just meditate. You can practice meditation in action. And that's what's happening when you practice an asana. You focus your attention, you focus on the body, you focus on the breathing, and cut down on the amount of mind wandering, which is distracting and also contributing to your body's stress system being more activated. Is there somewhere you can recommend where I can read up on the different types of yoga so I can find one to suit me? There are so many websites that actually answer this question in a major way. What you can do is just go onto those websites and see what they're about, see what practices are involved, and then do a comparison. And a lot of websites actually compare the different styles together. In our simple book, The Introduction to Yoga, which is through Harvard Health Publications, we have a whole section in that book that talks about how to choose the right style of yoga for you. It's not just about choosing the style, it's also about choosing the teacher and choosing the location. Because those can make a huge difference. And the only way to really find out is to practice these things. You have to go and try out these different styles. That's the best way to do it. It's like buying a car. You really have to test drive it. You have to do your research online to look at safety records, at repair records, and reliability. And then you have to actually go and test drive the car. Then you can make a purchase that's appropriate and you'll be happy with it. The same is true with yoga.
You really need to practice all these styles in order to get a sense. And as I say, a different teacher can give you a very different experience, even within the same style of yoga, within the same studio. So it's really a buyer's market, and you have to shop. And that means trying these things on. This question is, where would you recommend studies of the methods you speak of for yoga teachers? As you say, there is a lot of yoga taught in a non-traditional emitting meditation, breathing, and relaxation. Again, that's just basically going into yoga practices that are obviously more traditional in nature, that incorporate more components of yoga practice. And again, online, there is so much on yoga that you can virtually find everything you need if you type in the appropriate search question in a search engine. Question is, how long have you been personally practicing yoga? And thank you for sharing your knowledge with all of us. I've been practicing yoga since 1971, and I moved into a yoga ashram and began practicing a yoga lifestyle and teaching in 1973. So for me, this has been a lifelong practice. And I have taken this to my yoga research. So I've merged actually my scientific career together with my personal life. So I'm now all yoga all the time. And with my yoga research, this takes me to many other countries, including India, where they have many yoga research institutes and conferences. And so I get to interact with many of the leading yoga researchers in the world. So for me, it's a real honor and a privilege to be able to serve in this whole area of promoting and advancing research on yoga. Another question, many yoga research papers I've read don't specifically specify what I may call the dose and frequency of yoga practices. Is there a risk that we are comparing apples and cheese, or I guess apples and oranges is our phrase in science? That's one of the weaknesses in some of the publications in yoga research, that the methods will simply state they did 8 weeks of hatha yoga, and they won't tell you how many days, who was the teacher, how was he trained, how much pranayama, what were the actual exercises. So that's pressure in the field of yoga research to be more thorough in reporting our interventions. And that's something that the yoga research field needs to improve, certainly. And in terms of the issue of comparing apples and oranges, yes, if you have a study in one style of yoga and another study done in another style of yoga, and they're very different styles, I'm calling them yoga. Well, yes, they are different, and there's a lot of heterogeneity between these different styles, and there will be different effects from these different styles. But I'm calling them yoga because they incorporate at least one of those 4 components. So yoga is a sort of a term that I think has value. It does refer to these particular type of practices in some degree of combination. And so, yes, on the one hand, it is a valid term to lump all of these different types of yoga and interventions together. But on the other hand, when it comes down to actually looking at a specific study, you really have to get into the weeds, and you have to look exactly at what was done to give you a sense of what's being affected and involved. This question is, what are your thoughts on the multitude of yoga therapy trainings available? Does a yoga teacher have to take up further training in specific therapy areas to teach specific therapeutic groups? Particularly, the yoga teacher has a healthcare background. Absolutely. Yoga teaching to the general population is not the same as teaching yoga to a patient. A patient has very discrete and powerful vulnerabilities and limitations. And if you are not aware of those vulnerabilities and limitations, you can actually do more harm than good. So unless you are already a healthcare provider with that kind of knowledge, you need to get yourself trained up. So now we have these yoga therapy organizations which are certifying yoga therapy schools. And those yoga therapy schools will take people who are, first of all, trained as yoga teachers. They have a certification in a style of yoga. And then they go through an intensive training process about acquiring the information necessary to apply yoga safely and effectively to patient populations one-on-one. So this whole field of yoga therapy is very different than the field of yoga instruction. And yoga therapy really does take additional training if you really want to be safe and effective for patients. So this question I'm going to take further down. How widely is yoga practiced today in India, and is it integrated into their mainstream health system? Well, one thing about India is that although it's the home of yoga, one has to recognize that over the past 300 years or so, it was ruled by the British, and it was a British colony. And yoga was not part of the British lifestyle. So yoga was not front and center. It was a traditional practice that was done in the corners of society, if you will. That has changed and is beginning to change, especially now where the Prime Minister is an avid practitioner of yoga and a promoter of yoga. He's elevated one of the ministries that was responsible for yoga research to a ministerial status. There's now a ministry of support for yoga. Prime Minister Modi also went to the United Nations and argued for International Day of Yoga, which was approved by the United Nations. So now we have a strong promotion of this International Day of Yoga internationally on June 21st, and of course it's celebrated in India. I would say that the level of practice of yoga in India is higher than it is in the United States to some degree. The balance is different. There's more men practicing than there are in other countries. In other countries outside of India, it's really dominated by women. 75 to 80% outside of India are women practitioners, where it's more evenly distributed in India. But we don't have intensive surveys looking specifically at these practices. One survey that was recently done looked at all of the schools in India, and there's a movement by the government in India to try and implement yoga in schools. That survey showed that in government-run schools, almost 98% of the schools were offering yoga to some degree in the schools. So I think it's probably growing faster in India than it is in Western countries, at least starting very recently. But the other thing that you have to recognize in terms of the medical system is that the Indian medical system is really modeled on the Western system. And that is what is viewed as credible. And that's going to take time to change. So the healthcare system is not routinely implementing yoga in all of its practices, as one would hope over time. So here's a question. Do you think practices for resilience, especially for healthcare professionals, bypasses the real issue, lack of funding and staff in these areas of government not caring? This issue of burnout is huge in modern medicine. It is top of the agenda. On average, one physician in the United States commits suicide every day. So it's almost 400 a year that commit suicide. It's a very stressful profession. One of the biggest reasons it's a stressful profession is the nature of the profession itself, the requirements, the paperwork involved. And that is really creating a lot of stress. That structure, the logistics of the medical community is really one of the culprits. Now, it is possible to improve your resilience to stress and therefore able to cope with a dysfunctional system more effectively. Obviously, the answer has to be on both fronts. You need not only to fix the system, the logistics of the system, you also need to improve resilience to stress. In fact, in some of the literature, there's actually a reaction to many medical professionals who get very angry. They say, oh, look, it's not our fault. You're trying to tell us to increase our resilience. That's the fault of the medical system. It's not our fault that we have low resilience. And they get angry. And I can appreciate that. But on the other hand, by definition, medicine is a stressful profession. And I believe if you're going to engage in a stressful profession, you must engage in some kind of stress management practices. You can't go into this profession without resilience training. That's why Harvard Medical School is adopting this in its first-year students. And I think that's a valid thing to do. And I think it's a valid requirement that everyone that wants to go into a stressful profession should adopt and practice stress management characteristics. And that should be mandatory. It should be part of the profession. So for example, as an analogy, you can't become an astronaut. You can't go into space if you're not willing to do physical exercise. Because if you don't do physical exercise in orbit or in space, your muscles are going to wither away and you're going to get sick. So you can't be an astronaut and say, oh, okay, I'm an astronaut, but I don't want to do that. That is part of the skill set. It's part of the practices, the skills that you have to learn to become an astronaut. So this, I think, should be the same in the medical profession, which is a highly stressful profession, that you should learn stress management strategies as part of the profession. Well, I think I'm going to end right there. I thank you for all of your questions and your attention. And of course, I want to draw your attention to all of the other health fix talks that are out there. And I hope you all are coping well and stay healthy throughout this, throughout these very, very strange times that we're facing. Thanks again. Bye-bye.